The endless loop. The night began like any other. A quiet evening at home, the hum of my computer filling the small, dimly lit room. The rain outside tapped against the window, a steady rhythm that should have been soothing. But there was something off about that night, though I couldn't place what it was. I was scrolling through an obscure corner of the internet, the kind of place that felt like a secret, filled with threads discussing urban legends and forgotten mysteries. That's when I found it. A link titled, "Watch this and you'll understand everything." Curiosity got the better of me. The thread was short, filled with comments from people who claimed their lives had changed after watching the video. "It's not just a video," one comment read. "It's an experience. But be warned. Once you start, you can't stop." I clicked it. The screen flickered to life with a low-quality video. The setting was a dark, empty room, lit only by the glow of a single lamp in the corner. At first, there was nothing remarkable about it, just silence and the faint hum of static. But as the video continued, I started to feel watched. It wasn't anything I could see, but the sensation was there, prickling at the back of my neck. Suddenly, the camera panned sharply to the side, focusing on a figure in the shadows. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. I paused the video, a shiver running through me. Something about the way it moved, the way it stood there, felt all too real. Against my better judgment, I pressed play again. The figure stepped forward, its face coming into view. Except, it wasn't a face. It was my face. My exact likeness stared back at me from the screen. Only the eyes were empty voids, and the mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile. My reflection, the one on the screen, raised a hand and waved. I slammed my laptop shut, my heart pounding. It had to be a trick, some kind of deepfake or algorithmic manipulation. But then I noticed the faint reflection of my screen on the black surface of the laptop. The video was still playing. My distorted double was still waving. I threw the laptop open again, hoping to close the video, but the figure was gone. The screen showed nothing but static. I exhaled a shaky breath, trying to calm my nerves. "It's just a prank," I whispered, trying to convince myself. And then my phone buzzed. The notification was from an unknown number. It was a picture of me, sitting at my desk, staring at my computer. The timestamp showed it had been taken just seconds ago. My blood ran cold. I looked around the room, but there was no one there. The rain outside had intensified, drumming harder against the glass, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper now. Then the power went out. My computer screen was the only source of light. The static had disappeared, replaced by the same room from the video, but this time I was in it. I could see myself on the screen, standing in my darkened room, frozen in fear. Behind me, in the video, the figure appeared again, stepping out from the shadows. I whipped around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the screen, the figure was closer, its empty eyes locked onto mine, pointed at me, then at the corner of the room. I turned slowly, my breath caught in my throat. Nothing. When I turned back to the screen, the figure was gone. But a single line of text had appeared on the video. "Look closer." I didn't want to, couldn't, but my body moved on its own, my trembling hands reaching for the laptop. The screen flickered, and suddenly, my webcam light blinked on. I saw my own face staring back at me, except it wasn't me. My doppelganger grinned widely, tilting its head the same way the figure had. Then it whispered, "You shouldn't have watched." The screen went black, and for a moment, there was silence. I sat there, paralyzed, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I screamed and spun around, but the room was empty. My laptop powered itself down, the faint whir of the fan fading into nothingness. I sat in the dark, clutching my chest, trying to convince myself it was over. But it wasn't. The next day, my computer refused to turn on. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications from unknown numbers, each one showing distorted images of my face in places I'd never been. At night, I could hear faint whispers coming from the walls, growing louder whenever I tried to sleep. And every time I passed a reflective surface, I could see it. My double, watching, waiting, smiling. It's been weeks now, and I can't escape it. My reflection moves on its own, mocking me, whispering things I can't quite hear. I don't know what it wants, but I know one thing. It all started with that video. So if you ever see a link promising to show you the truth, promising to change your life, don't click it. Some things aren't meant to be watched. I think my daughter's doll is possessed. Thrift shopping had always been a sort of ritual for my wife and me. We'd hit up estate sales, thrift stores, garage sales, even old shops on their last legs, picking up whatever caught our eye to breathe new life into our home. Nearly everything around us had a story. Things that, in their quiet way, had been through someone else's life before they became part of ours. Cookware, furniture, our daughter's toys, clothes, it didn't matter. If it was well made and had some years left, it was good enough for us. Growing up the way we did, my wife and I both learned early on not to waste anything. We weren't poor now, not by a long shot, but when you've spent your childhood stretching every dollar, that waste not mentality never fully leaves. It's more than a habit. It's instinct. I'd become something of a hawk for deals, tracking social media for those inevitable posts about local stores closing down, big sales, liquidations, anything with a shot at uncovering a hidden gem. It was like a hobby, and that's how I found out about the toy store. An old post, buried deep on the community page, announced the auction of a local toy shop that had been a fixture in the town since the Great Depression. The place was special. I'd been there once as a kid, and I remembered the almost magical feeling of the store. The smell of old wood and varnish, the glint of paint on row after row of handmade toys. This wasn't your usual toy store. The owner, an older man everyone knew as Mr. Winslow, had poured his life into every toy, carving and painting each one by hand. Wooden soldiers, miniature dollhouses, delicate puzzles. Everything you could imagine. He never imported a single thing, and every toy had a strange, vintage charm that you couldn't find anywhere else. Mr. Winslow and his wife had run the shop right up until they died, years apart. They didn't have any family left, so the state had seized the property, and now they were auctioning everything off, right down to the last hand-carved toy. The sale was on a cold, gray Saturday. I convinced my wife it'd be worth checking out, maybe picking up a few toys for our daughter. The place was in rough shape, dim and drafty. Half the lights didn't work, and the smell of dust lingered heavy in the air, clinging to everything like a veil. But the toys, they were immaculate. Each shelf was still filled with tiny wooden faces frozen in mid-expression, each toy glancing out at us, wide-eyed and almost expectant. The crowd at the auction was familiar, dotted with faces I'd seen at sales like this before. Liquidation sales bring out a certain kind of person. You can always tell who's a regular and who's new to the scene just by watching them bid. The newcomers hesitate, test the waters before committing to any serious bid. But the regulars, the seasoned ones, they've got a rhythm. They know exactly how high to go, exactly when to pull back. Most of them aren't there to pick up keepsakes. They're there to flip it all for a profit online. In most liquidation sales, they bundle the goods in bulk, which suits the resellers just fine. You see a table stacked with, say, 100 of the same porcelain vase or unopened action figure. People bid on the lot, the highest bidder picks their fill, and then the next one steps up. It's efficient. By the end, whatever's left just goes for the average bid price. First come, first serve. But Mr. Winslow's toy store wasn't your average liquidation. No one was here for bulk toys from China, and no one was going to find a stack of hot-ticket items like last season's electronics. Every item was unique, handcrafted and individually priced. There wasn't a single barcode in the building, not a plastic wrapper in sight. Every toy was a labor of love, something that had been sanded, painted, and assembled by hand. It was like stepping into a time capsule, each piece carrying a bit of the old man's life and passion. The toys looked like relics from another era. Wooden horses with faded paint, lines of tin soldiers standing rigid, delicate porcelain dolls with blank, glassy eyes. There were marionettes on thin, tangled strings, and intricate dollhouses with hand-painted wallpaper and tiny furniture inside. Toys made for another world, another life. Most of the people there took one look and left early, their disinterest written all over their faces. These weren't things that would sell for much online. And with the store's gloomy atmosphere and the unsettling shadows cast by the dim light, I didn't blame them. But I was in it for more than a quick sale. I'd come to find a treasure, maybe something special to put on a shelf for our daughter or a keepsake to remind me of a place that had been in the town forever. So I stayed, wandering the aisles, running my fingers along the toys' edges, feeling the worn, chipped paint under my fingers. The auction had turned out to be a bust. I wandered around the store one last time, eyeing the shelves filled with dusty old toys, and I was just about ready to leave empty-handed when my daughter tugged on my sleeve. "Daddy, look!" She pointed to a battered old toy box shoved in a corner. Sitting upright inside it, propped against the side like she'd been carefully placed there, was a plush doll. But this wasn't just any stuffed toy. The doll was eerily life-sized, just about the same height as my daughter, in fact. It had stringy blonde hair that cascaded messily down its shoulders, 2 large button eyes stitched onto a cloth face, and a stitched-on smile that seemed just a little too wide, curling up at the edges in a way that didn't quite feel right. The doll wore a faded black dress with lace trimming, adding to its peculiar charm. My daughter rushed over, her face lighting up with excitement. She plucked the doll from the toy box and hugged it tightly, like she'd found a long-lost friend. "Her name is Dolly," she declared, squeezing the doll with the kind of fierce, unfiltered affection only a child can muster. I looked at the doll more closely, a little unsettled by its fixed, button-eyed stare, and that odd smile that seemed to follow me even as I shifted from side to side. There was something strange about its proportions, almost as if it had been crafted specifically to look like a child. But not quite. The auctioneer, clearly tired of a morning spent trying to hawk dusty old toys to an uninterested crowd, noticed my interest and gave a half-hearted wave. "Take it if you want," he said with a shrug. "Ain't nobody bidding on this junk. Most of it's headed for the dump. You find anything else you like, feel free to pick through it. Won't cost you more than a few dollars." The truth was, there wasn't anything else in that store I wanted, and after an auctioneer calls the merchandise garbage, it's a good hint to leave. I paid him a few dollars for Dolly, who was now practically glued to my daughter's side. She clutched the doll's hand, looking at me with a beaming grin that melted any lingering doubts I might have had. As we left, I noticed that my daughter was oddly quiet. Normally, she'd chatter all the way home, talking about every little thing she saw, but this time, she just held Dolly close, staring out the window with a sort of distant expression, almost like she was listening. It was subtle, but it was there. I chalked it up to the thrill of her new toy and figured she was probably just imagining adventures for Dolly, weaving stories in her head like she often did. Still, something felt strange. I couldn't shake the feeling that the doll's stitched-on eyes were watching me, even as I drove, catching glimpses of it in the rearview mirror. And though my daughter was silent, there was a sort of tension in the car, a quiet that seemed to settle in like a chill. We pulled into the driveway, and I glanced back at my daughter, who was still holding Dolly, her fingers entwined with the doll's soft fabric hand. She looked up at me with a serene smile. "She really likes it here, Daddy," she whispered, as if Dolly herself had somehow told her. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it was just a doll, a cheap, old-fashioned plush left over in a toy store no one cared about. But as we stepped inside, I couldn't help feeling we'd brought something else home with us that day. Something that had been waiting patiently in that dusty corner, in a forgotten store full of discarded things. And now it had found a new place to belong. In the weeks that followed, my daughter's attachment to Dolly grew into an obsession. First, my wife and I thought it was adorable. Kids have imaginary friends all the time, right? And if she wanted to treat Dolly as her special friend, that seemed harmless enough. At any given moment, you could find my daughter playing with Dolly. She held tea parties for the two of them, setting up our good china in tiny rows on her play table. Dolly always had the seat of honor, perched across from my daughter, her button eyes staring straight ahead, her strange stitched smile ever present. When it wasn't tea parties, it was school. My daughter would line up her other stuffed animals, but Dolly was always in the front row, right under her watchful eye. I'd hear her talking to Dolly, sometimes even scolding her in a low, serious voice, like she was dealing with a difficult student. She'd talk with Dolly while watching TV, telling her all the things that were happening on the screen as if the doll was hanging on to every word. We chalked it up to a vivid imagination. But soon, things started to feel different. I noticed my daughter no longer touched any of her other toys. They lay scattered around her room, gathering dust. Her entire world revolved around Dolly. One evening, we sat down for dinner. It was spaghetti night, my daughter's favorite, and my wife had gone all out. We called her to the table, expecting her to leave Dolly behind like usual. But tonight, she walked into the dining room, gripping Dolly by the arm, and carefully set her down on the chair next to her. "Can Dolly have a plate too?" she asked, her voice full of a strange kind of insistence. My wife and I exchanged a glance, an uneasy one. We both shrugged it off and played along, thinking it was just a phase. My wife set an empty plate in front of Dolly, miming a spoonful of spaghetti onto it with a playful smile. But our daughter's face fell, her expression crumpling as she stared down at the empty plate in front of Dolly. "She needs real food, Mom," she said, her voice small and hurt. "Honey, she gets special pretend food, because she's a pretend person," my wife explained gently, trying to meet her halfway. My daughter's expression twisted into something dark and angry, a look we'd never seen from her before. Her face flushed, and her eyes filled with tears as she screamed, "No, Dolly hasn't eaten in decades. She's hungry." The words came out in a wail, raw and full of a desperate, gut-wrenching emotion that seemed so out of place. It was as if she was pleading for a real, living person, as though Dolly's hunger was a tangible, undeniable fact. She grabbed the doll, cradling it protectively as if we had wronged it, her face red with frustration and hurt. When we tried to calm her down, she started kicking, screaming, inconsolable. She clung to Dolly, her knuckles turning white, her small voice rising in a frantic, guttural cry that we'd never heard from her before. Eventually, we had no choice but to pick her up, gently prying her from Dolly's side. She thrashed and shouted as we carried her to her room, leaving Dolly alone at the kitchen table. As I closed her bedroom door, my heart still pounding from the outburst, I found myself staring back at the dining room. There sat Dolly, her button eyes unblinking, her crooked smile staring straight ahead as if mocking me. The room felt quiet, too quiet, and as I stood there, I could have sworn I saw the faintest twitch in Dolly's stitched mouth, a subtle shift, as if she were smiling just a bit wider. I shook it off, forcing myself to laugh at the absurdity of it. It was just a doll, just fabric and stuffing. But as I turned out the kitchen light, leaving Dolly in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, she was still watching me. It took a long time to calm our daughter down. She kept sniffling, wiping at her nose, and muttering how unfair it was that Dolly hadn't been given food. She clutched at her pajamas, her small fists trembling with frustration and sorrow, saying she just wanted Dolly to be happy. My wife, always the peacemaker, gave me a gentle nudge. "Just get the doll, please," she whispered, glancing back at our daughter. "It'll help her calm down." I nodded, reluctantly heading back to the kitchen, feeling a strange knot forming in my stomach. As I walked into the room, an odd chill seeped into my skin, making me pause at the doorway. Dolly wasn't where we'd left her. We had set her at the dinner table, facing her empty plate, exactly where my daughter had insisted. But now she was turned in her chair, her body rotated to face down the hallway that led to my daughter's room. Her button eyes seemed to glint in the dim light, her crooked smile somehow looking sharper, hungrier. I shook my head, brushing off the unsettling feeling as a trick of the light. It was just a doll. Maybe the chair had shifted when my daughter thrashed in the dining room, and in the chaos I just hadn't noticed. I picked Dolly up, her fabric cold against my skin, and carried her back to my daughter's room. I stepped inside, And the moment my daughter saw Dolly in my hands, her face lit up, her eyes going wide with relief and joy. She jumped up, practically launching herself at me to grab her beloved doll. The way she held Dolly, it was like she was reuniting with a real friend, someone she'd been separated from for a lifetime. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered, clutching Dolly tightly, pressing her cheek against the doll's button-eyed face. My wife sat beside her on the bed, running her fingers through our daughter's hair, soothing her. As the tension in the room faded, my daughter murmured something, barely a breath. "What did you say, sweetie?" I asked, leaning closer. She looked up at me, her face soft and serene, and repeated it, her voice clear. "Dolly's full now." A shiver ran through me, but before I could think too much of it, she broke into a grin, her usual playful energy returning. "Can I watch TV now?" My wife shot me a confused glance but quickly regained her composure. "After you eat your dinner, okay?" Our daughter nodded, happily returning to the dining room to finish her meal. She didn't ask about Dolly's food, didn't protest or insist on setting an extra plate. She ate without complaint, chattering occasionally about her favorite cartoons. The strange outburst over Dolly seemed forgotten, almost as if it hadn't happened at all. After dinner, she padded off to the living room and settled in front of the TV. Dolly perched beside her, her tiny hands still wrapped around the dolls. We exchanged wary glances, but neither of us dared speak the questions lingering in our minds. The quiet in the house had returned, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. That night, there were no more whispers about Dolly being hungry, no more outbursts or demands for extra plates at the table. My wife and I, unsure of what to make of it, decided to let it go. Whatever had happened, our daughter was calm, happy even. And if Dolly had something to do with that, well, we weren't about to argue with a win. That night, after we tucked our daughter into bed and cleaned up the kitchen, my wife and I sat together at the dining room table, mulling over the evening's strange events. "She's 8 now," my wife said, her voice low, like she didn't want to risk our daughter hearing, even though her room was on the other side of the house. "Isn't she a little old to be pretending a doll is, well, real?" I nodded, rubbing my temples. I was thinking the same thing. I mean, she did this before, but back when she was really little, 2 or 3 maybe. And even then, it wasn't this intense. We'd both noticed that her behavior with Dolly was different than her usual flights of imagination. At that age, she'd had a few imaginary friends, nothing we worried about. She'd talk to her stuffed animals, play act scenarios. It was normal stuff. But now, with Dolly, her behavior seemed fervent. Like Dolly wasn't just a doll she liked, but something essential, almost sacred to her. "We could maybe take the doll away?" I suggested, not liking the idea even as I said it. My wife shook her head. "If we just took Dolly, she'd be inconsolable. And honestly, I don't want another outburst like tonight. We'd have to handle it carefully." After a few minutes of back and forth, we came up with a plan. We'd gradually phase Dolly out. We'd get our daughter hooked on something new, a fun toy or play set she couldn't resist. And once she'd lost interest in Dolly, we'd quietly take the doll away while she was at school. But this plan was harder to execute than we thought. We spent the next week scouring stores for the latest toys, something we usually avoided given our thrift shop lifestyle. We bought dolls with accessories, elaborate playsets, building kits, anything we thought might catch her attention. We figured we'd splurge just this once if it meant keeping her happy and moving her away from Dolly. Yet, no matter what we brought home, she barely looked at the new toys. Her enthusiasm was tepid, at best. She'd unwrap the new toy, inspect it with a polite sort of interest, and then inevitably wander back to wherever Dolly was waiting. My wife and I tried everything, even bringing home a new board game, hoping it'd be something we could play together as a family. But Dolly was always right there, tucked under my daughter's arm or seated by her side, a silent companion with her button eyes and stitched smile, watching us from across the table. Finally, in a last-ditch effort, we went out and bought her a tablet. We figured that with all the educational games, drawing apps, and videos at her fingertips, surely she'd be glued to it like most kids her age. But she barely gave it a second glance. "Thanks, Mom and Dad," she said when we handed it to her. But there was something distant in her eyes, She held Dolly close, almost protectively, her thumb tracing the doll's tiny hand. But Dolly doesn't like tablets. The words, though innocent enough, sent a chill down my spine. It was like she was speaking not for herself, but on behalf of her doll, as though Dolly had a voice, an opinion, a preference. My wife and I exchanged worried glances. We'd tried everything, and it seemed our daughter's attachment to Dolly was only deepening. She barely even touched the new toys. They lay untouched in her room, some still in their boxes, collecting dust. With a heavy heart, we decided to go forward with our original plan. We would wait until she was at school, slip Dolly out of sight, and hope that, with enough new distractions around her, she'd find something else to latch onto. We both felt a pang of guilt. Seeing the joy Dolly brought her, the way her face lit up when she held the doll, made it hard to imagine taking that away. But our concern for her well-being outweighed everything else. So we waited, biding our time, and hoped that, in Dolly's absence, our daughter would turn her attention to one of the other toys. But deep down, I had a feeling this wouldn't go as smoothly as we hoped. The night before we were set to pull off our plan, I had the strangest dream. At least, I think it was a dream. I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, when a chill crept over me. It felt like something was watching us, something cold and patient. I didn't want to look, but in the way dreams force you, I felt my eyes drift toward the end of the bed. There, just at the edge of my vision, was Dolly. She was standing up, perfectly still, her button eyes fixed on me. I couldn't make out any details, just her shadowy outline, a figure waiting silently, as if she had all the time in the world. Every time I tried to turn my head to look directly at her, she vanished, slipping back into the corner of my sight. When I woke up, my heart was pounding, my skin damp with cold sweat. I shook it off, trying to convince myself it was just the stress of the past few weeks getting to me. That morning, as planned, my wife took our daughter to school, distracting her with promises of a new game they'd play together that evening. The house felt unnaturally still once they were gone, a heavy silence that seemed to press against my skin. I took a deep breath, heading into my daughter's room, where Dolly was resting on her bed. Picking her up felt strange, like I was holding something more than just a doll. I avoided looking into those button eyes and quickly made my way to the pantry. I stuffed her into the top back corner, where my daughter wouldn't think to look, carefully positioning her behind a stack of canned goods. As expected, when my daughter came home and saw that Dolly was missing, all hell broke loose. The tantrum was unlike anything I'd ever seen. She stormed through the house, screaming, throwing things, demanding we give Dolly back. It was as if she was possessed by some uncontainable rage. Her small face twisted into an expression that was both heartbroken and furious. My wife and I tried to calm her down, to reason with her, but she wasn't listening. "Where's Dolly?" she shrieked, her voice hoarse from crying. "You'll regret this. Dolly's going to hurt you. She'll make you sorry. Give her back." Her words left a chill running through my veins. This wasn't our daughter speaking, not the sweet, gentle child we'd raised. She'd always been polite, soft-spoken, never the kind of kid who threw tantrums or even raised her voice much. But now, she seemed almost feral, her eyes wild with an intensity that was unnerving. The tantrum went on for hours, our daughter's screams echoing through the house, until she finally wore herself out. With her voice raw and every tear shed, she collapsed onto the couch, exhausted and half asleep. My wife and I sat nearby, sharing exhausted, worried glances, feeling like we'd made a terrible mistake, but unable to go back on our decision now. Once we were sure she was asleep, we carried her to her bed, laying her down gently and turning on her night light. We murmured soft goodnights, though we made sure not to wake her. We thought the worst of it was over for the night, that we'd weathered the storm and could finally get a moment to breathe. But when we walked back into the living room, a chill settled over me, prickling the back of my neck. My heart dropped when I saw it. There, sitting on the couch in the exact spot where my daughter had just been sleeping, was Dolly. She sat upright, her button eyes fixed straight ahead, her stitched smile just a little too wide, too knowing. We stood there, frozen, staring at her in stunned silence. Neither of us had touched the doll since I'd hidden her in the pantry. There was no way she could have gotten back to the living room on her own. My wife reached out, her hand trembling as if to pick Dolly up, but then thought better of it and pulled her hand back, wrapping her arms around herself instead. I could feel the words I wanted to say caught in my throat. Instead, I moved forward slowly, as if approaching something dangerous, and took Dolly in my hands, her fabric cold and somehow heavier than before. I was careful not to look at her too closely, afraid that if I met those button eyes for too long, I'd see something I couldn't unsee. I brought her back to the pantry, stuffing her into the corner again, this time piling more cans in front of her, pushing them in tightly to make sure she wouldn't move. I left the pantry, shutting the door firmly behind me. When I returned to the living room, my wife was still standing there, her face pale. We didn't say a word. We just sat there in silence, the weight of that empty stitched smile lingering in the room. And as we sat there, I found myself thinking about my daughter's words, her warning echoing in my mind. Dolly's going to hurt you. She'll make you sorry. My wife and I sat on the couch, staring at each other, hearts pounding in our chests, with the realization that neither of us had moved Dolly from her hiding place in the pantry. We both knew it couldn't have been our daughter either. She'd been asleep the whole time. And yet, there was Dolly sitting in the exact spot where our daughter had drifted off on the couch, like she'd claimed it as her own. "This is too much," my wife whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't want that doll in the house anymore. Please just get rid of it." She looked at me with pleading eyes, and I couldn't blame her. Every logical part of me wanted to dismiss what was happening, but that feeling, that lingering chill creeping down my spine, told me it was best to listen. I didn't want Dolly here either. Whatever this was, it needed to end. I scooped Dolly up, feeling that unnatural heaviness in her again, like she was almost pulling me back, as if the doll didn't want to leave. I ignored the way her stitched smile seemed to stretch just a little more as I turned toward the door, telling myself it was just a trick of my tired mind. I had to get her out. Outside, the early morning was eerily quiet. The community dumpster stood at the far end of the lot, and I made my way over, clutching Dolly tight, every step feeling more difficult than the last. A weight, like icy fingers, seemed to wrap around my shoulders, tendrils of dread clawing at my chest. It was ridiculous. I knew it was just a doll, but it felt like something was whispering in my ear, urging me to stop, to turn around, to take Dolly back inside. I shook it off, forcing myself to keep walking. When I reached the dumpster, I flung the lid open, staring into the dark, reeking void below. With a grimace, I tossed Dolly inside, hearing the muffled thud as she hit the bottom, then slammed the heavy lid shut with a sense of finality. As I walked back to the house, a small but persistent voice in my mind whispered that this wasn't over, but I pushed it down, reasoning that we'd done the right thing. Dolly was gone. Our daughter would be upset, but with some time, she'd move on. The next morning, when our daughter woke up, her eyes darted around the room, searching, and she quickly realized Dolly was missing. Her face fell, and she looked up at me, desperation clouding her eyes. But this time, she was different. It was as though something in her understood, resigned and hurt. She didn't throw a tantrum. She didn't scream or demand Dolly back. She just sighed, shoulders slumped, and went about getting ready for school with a defeated sort of sadness. "Promise to be good, okay?" I said, brushing her hair out of her face as she sat at the breakfast table. She nodded, though her gaze was fixed somewhere distant, somewhere I couldn't follow. After we got her on the bus and my wife headed to work, I finally allowed myself to relax. Maybe we'd done it, I thought. Maybe we'd finally won the battle. I made myself a coffee, settled into my office, and powered up my laptop, planning to get some work done in the quiet house. The familiar hum of the computer and the routine of logging into emails and files felt comforting, ordinary. I let myself get lost in it, ignoring the lingering memories of the past few days, trying to embrace the calm. But then, just as I was settling in, I heard it. A soft, drawn-out creak, like someone slowly pushing the door open. My heart froze. I looked up from my screen, eyes darting to the door. It was open, just a crack, though I distinctly remembered shutting it when I'd sat down. "Hello," I called, my voice barely more than a whisper, straining to listen for any sound in return. Nothing. A chill ran down my spine as I pushed back from my desk, rising slowly, my eyes locked on that narrow sliver of the door, as if expecting something to appear there. I took a cautious step forward, reaching out to push the door wider, my breath caught in my throat. And that's when I saw it. Sitting there, just outside my office, was Dolly. She was propped up in the hallway, her button eyes fixed on the door, her head tilted just slightly, as if she were studying me. That stitched smile, wider than I remembered, curved in an expression that was almost triumphant. I stumbled back, feeling my stomach twist as that dreadful realization settled over me. I'd thrown her away. I'd seen her hit the bottom of that dumpster. But here she was, back in my house, waiting, like she'd never left. Dolly sat there, covered in dirt, grime, and bits of garbage clinging to her black dress, her button eyes still fixed on me. For a moment, I could only stare, paralyzed by disbelief and dread. I took a step back, not even noticing the wall behind me until my shoulders hit it. I had thrown her away. I had seen her at the bottom of that dumpster. And yet, here she was, sitting on my hallway floor, filthy and somehow more sinister than ever. Then, before I could even process what I was seeing, Dolly began to rise. Her small body lifted into the air, hovering just above the floor. The air felt thick, almost electric, like the whole house was holding its breath. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, in a rush, a series of images flashed through my mind. Terrible, twisted visions filled my head, screaming faces, dark, tangled forests, and a sense of looming, inescapable dread. The world around me seemed to fade away, swallowed by shadows. My vision blurred, and in the next instant, I was no longer standing in my hallway. I was in a forest, a dense, suffocating darkness pressing down on me from all sides. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran, my legs pumping through thick underbrush. My feet stumbled over roots and rocks, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. It was like being inside the worst kind of nightmare, but the terror was too real, too sharp to dismiss as mere fantasy. Something was behind me, chasing me. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and my blood ran cold. A massive beast, towering and monstrous, loped through the shadows, its movements fluid but unnatural, as if its joints were barely holding together. It looked like a wolf, but larger than any wolf I'd ever seen, with a gaping maw that stretched grotesquely across its face, almost as if it were barely attached by a thin hinge of jaw. Its eyes burned a bright, unsettling red, like twin buttons sewn deep into its skull, and its body was held together with thick, fraying threads, giving it a twisted, stitched appearance that reminded me horribly of Dolly. The beast let out a growl, and the sound was like 1,000 voices, guttural and inhuman. I stumbled, my legs giving out beneath me as I crashed to the forest floor. The rancid smell of decay filled the air as the creature loomed over me, its hot, foul breath washing over my face. It was like staring into the face of a nightmare made real, a vision of pure, unfiltered terror. I tried to push myself up, to run, but the beast was too fast. It lowered its massive head, bearing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth, each one as sharp as a dagger. I braced my arms against its maw, desperate to hold it back, but the beast was impossibly strong. Black, oily ichor dripped from its mouth, splattering onto my arms and chest, the stench nearly choking me. "This isn't real," I shouted, my voice breaking with desperation. "Leave me alone." But the creature's glowing red eyes narrowed, and I felt a crushing weight as it bore down on me. Its teeth sunk into my shoulder, sending a wave of agony tearing through my body. I screamed, the pain sharp and cold, a raw fire spreading through my veins. I could feel its teeth tearing into me, feel the slick heat of blood as it spilled down my side. With a surge of frantic energy, I brought my knee up, slamming it into the beast's chest, trying to shove it back. But it barely budged. The creature's maw twisted, a sick, twisted semblance of a grin, its red button eyes glinting with something almost playful. "Wake up! Wake up!" I yelled, every ounce of my mind focused on breaking free of this nightmare. I was trapped, I knew it, but I couldn't give up. Images of my daughter, my wife, flashed before my eyes, filling me with a fierce determination. I couldn't let this thing win. I couldn't let it keep me here. With a final scream, I pushed against the creature, throwing every ounce of strength I had into one last desperate shove. My body ached. My mind felt splintered, but I focused on them, on my family, on getting back to them. The creature's grip loosened, if only slightly, and I clawed at the ground, digging my fingers into the dirt as I struggled to pull myself free. I kept fighting, clinging to that small, stubborn spark of hope. And then, with a sudden, blinding flash, the forest disappeared. I found myself back in the hallway, Dolly lying lifeless on the ground in front of me. My head was spinning, still trapped somewhere between the nightmare forest and reality. But one sensation cut through the fog, a searing pain on my chest. I pressed my hand to it, feeling the strange, raw heat radiating from beneath my shirt. With trembling hands, I pulled my shirt over my head and looked down. My skin was marked with thick, jagged scars, pale and twisted, like they'd been there for years. They traced the spot where the beast had sunk its teeth, a brutal reminder of what I had just endured, or maybe survived. I looked down at Dolly, her button eyes gazing blankly up at me, her face filled with that eerie, stitched grin. Rage bubbled up inside me, pushing past the confusion and horror of what had just happened. Enough was enough. This doll had wormed its way into my life, into my daughter's mind, and I couldn't let it haunt us any longer. Without another thought, I scooped her up and strode to the garage. I grabbed a can of kerosene, nearly spilling it in my haste, and snatched a box of matches we kept for family fires in the backyard. Today, we'd be having a fire of a different kind. The backyard was quiet, almost too quiet, as I made my way to the fire pit. I threw Dolly in, her soft body crumpling against the grate, and stuffed a few pieces of old newspaper around her. The doll's face stared up at me, an almost pleading look in her button eyes. And then, out of nowhere, I felt it, hesitation. A nagging, sick feeling gnawed at me. A tiny voice in my head begging me to stop, like I was about to destroy something important, something I should cherish. It was absurd, but the feeling was almost overwhelming, like Dolly herself was reaching into my mind, whispering to me, making me doubt. No, I told myself, she's nothing, just a doll. I shook off the creeping doubt, forcing my hands to steady as I unscrewed the kerosene cap and doused her, watching as the liquid soaked into her fabric, darkening the black dress and matting her tangled hair. With one last breath, I struck a match and, without hesitating further, tossed it in. The flames roared to life, but instead of the usual red and orange, they flickered a strange, dark purple, licking over Dolly's body with an otherworldly glow. I watched, transfixed, as her face seemed to contort within the flames, her button eyes bulging slightly, her smile twisting as if alive, fighting against the fire's embrace. But I held firm, rooted to the spot, determined to watch until there was nothing left but ashes. I sat there by the fire pit, ignoring the urgent pings of work emails and notifications from my laptop still inside. None of it mattered. Not right now. I stayed there, keeping vigil until the doll was nothing more than charred scraps, the purple flames fading into smoldering embers. Hours later, when it was time to pick up my daughter from school, I finally stood up, feeling a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. Dolly was gone, nothing more than a burnt heap, but the scars on my chest tingled, reminding me of the nightmare I couldn't quite shake. When I picked up my daughter from school that afternoon, she came running toward me, her face lighting up with that familiar, heartwarming grin. It was as if the past few weeks, the tantrums, the outbursts, the strange fixation on Dolly had never happened. She wrapped her arms around my waist, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Daddy, guess what? I got a gold star on my spelling test, and we made clay animals in art today. Mine's a bunny, I'll bring it home to show you tomorrow. I hugged her back, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. It was like having my little girl back, the bright, happy child I'd known before Dolly came into our lives. The darkness that had hung over her seemed to have vanished, leaving no trace, no lingering shadows. She didn't ask about Dolly. She didn't even seem to notice the doll was gone. That night, as we sat down for dinner, she chattered about her day, telling us all the little details we'd missed, her laughter filling the house with warmth that had been absent for far too long. My wife and I exchanged relieved glances, finally allowing ourselves to believe that it was over. Later, after our daughter was asleep, I told my wife everything. The nightmare in the forest, the scars on my chest, the way Dolly had been lying in the hallway, filthy and somehow waiting. I explained how I'd taken her to the fire pit, how I'd watched the doll burn with those strange purple flames, staying there until I was sure every last piece of her was gone. My wife listened, her expression shifting from shock to disbelief. I could tell she was skeptical, and who could blame her? I wasn't sure I'd believe it myself if I hadn't seen it all firsthand. But in the end, she squeezed my hand, her lips curving into a soft smile. "Well, real or not," she said, "I'm just glad that thing is gone. Our daughter's back, and that's what matters." I nodded, feeling the scars on my chest itch slightly under my shirt, something that will always remind me of the nightmare I'd lived through. But as I looked down the hall, hearing my daughter's soft breathing from her room, I knew that we were finally safe. Dolly was gone, our daughter was free, and, for the first time in weeks, our home felt like ours again.